Hey everybody. Let's see. Matt, can you hear me okay still?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Can everybody out there hear us all right? Just to double check, if you could put in the chat.
My neighbor just decided to cut down a tree. So in the background, I can hear people with chainsaws and stump grinders. So, hey, it's a perfect time.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Hey, Omer, thanks. Very cool. So I guess do you want to do a quick intro, Matt, for who we are and all that?
Yeah. So my name's Matt from Castos.com, podcast hosting company that I didn't make the original connection to you, Ward, but our CEO, Craig Hewitt, did. And your company, your MemberSpace product is our first and featured integration into our private podcasting stuff. So I've been a podcaster for about 8 years now. I joined Castos about 90-ish days ago, but who's counting? And, to do all things podcast and help Craig and team with running the podcast. So happy to be here today to talk about, what we're doing with podcasting and where we see a lot of great value in like private and member only podcasts, which goes great against your audience.
Yeah. And I'm Ward Sandler. I'm the co-founder and CEO over at MemberSpace. Like Matt said, we're an integration partner with Castos and vice versa. And kind of the goal of this webinar is to help anyone who's listening just kind of figure out where does private podcasting fit into your membership, if at all. It's not necessarily something everybody should do, for sure. But if it is something that makes sense, we kind of want to explain to you some of the benefits and maybe some of the things you haven't necessarily thought of about how this could actually help supplement a membership, help grow a membership, help start a membership, all that good stuff we'll dive into.
Yeah. And not even, I'd love to just answer or field any questions about podcasting or public podcasting in general, right? It doesn't have to be private. It can certainly be just podcasting at large, great way to build an audience, right? And then funnel them into a private podcast or just your private community in general, which is super helpful, I think, both ways. Cool, man. So I can share my screen, dive into the slides. Let me just find it here. 1 second. Boom. Everyone should be able to see that.
I can. Cool. If the chat, if you could just let us know if you can see it. Yep. Cool. Thanks, Liam.
Yeah. So our official title for today's presentation is how to increase the value of your membership with a private podcast. As we just mentioned, that's some of the stuff that we'll be chatting about. Should be a fairly brief agenda. I could talk about this stuff literally for hours, but I won't bore you with that, but happy to answer any questions, as we move along, of course, presented by your two favorite live streamers, Ward and myself. And like we talked about, today's agenda, we'll talk about the value of podcasting for memberships, how a private podcast can help your membership, and then how to get started with a private podcast. And I can even show off, of course, Windows updates just asked me to update, and I'm going to hit no on that.
It's like they wait for the worst time possible.
Yeah, we'll just do that. Cut trees down and update my operating system all at the same time. It's a wonderful thing. So look, the value of podcasting for membership site owners, this I hope is probably the most obvious for many people watching. Podcasting, of course, I'm biased, and Ward, when you were on our podcast, the audience podcast, we talked about how creating content and creating evergreen content is super important. But podcasting, I think it goes like this. I think it goes video and then audio, and then, obviously written and maybe interactive content after that. And podcasting is one of those things where you can sit down for, I don't know, whatever, half hour, an hour. And this isn't rocket science. This isn't new, but you can take that conversation, you could take those episodes and promote them in a million different ways, right? You have the episode in its entirety. You can break that down into the blog post. You can break that down into an email newsletter. You can break that down into quotes that go out on social media. You can do all kinds of things. And the best thing about it is not only is that searchable and evergreen, but once you start to build a library of content, this is a thing that we're doing right now at Castos is like, look, we've got whatever we have now, almost 100 episodes in audience. how do we bucket this? How do we categorize it? How do we put it into a filterable system? Probably like what a lot of people who use MemberSpace already do. Like, how do we create a sortable, filterable library of content that can be delivered in either lesson or academy like style, right? That's one of the interesting things about the longevity of a podcast is you start to build this back catalog and it's not over, right? It's not done. You should never look at those literally hours, hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours spent creating a podcast as just they're done and they're gone, in the wind. These are things that you can go back on and repurpose and create actionable content around, right? So it's not just an awareness and attention thing. It is half of that, half the game is driving that attention, driving that awareness, but it's a great fundamental piece of content. Ward, I don't know, like from the MemberSpace community, do you know off the top of your head, are a lot of people using podcasting as a front-facing mechanism to drive traffic to their membership sites?
I'd say a fair number are. To be honest, I don't actually know what percentage. We don't track that granularly. Maybe we should, but we don't. So,
sure.
But yeah, I've definitely like come across it like anecdotally for sure. There's folks who have just generally a podcast to get a broad audience in, to know about their company, know about their brand, and that could be a free podcast, like a standard podcast that you would get. But then we definitely have folks who also have private podcasts where it's like, hey, you need to be a member to get to this podcast, or it's like a premium version of the free public podcast where it's like, hey, maybe it's extended, maybe there's no ad reads, things like that. But I actually had a quick question, Matt, if you don't mind, if we could just go back to what you were initially saying about you kind of laying out the tiers of like video, I think you said, and then audio, and then I think you said like written content. What maybe I missed it. What did you mean exactly by that? Like tiers of like, what is that a tier of?
Yeah. So when I think of, when you take a 50,000 foot view approach of this, anybody who's thinking about starting a podcast or like content marketing in general, they sit back and they go, okay, how much time is this going to take me? Like, where am I going to invest my time, my money? Where's my team going to invest that time and money into? And for some folks, they can't do everything. And so they pick one channel. And with like content creation in general, if you can start with, say, video, right? This is something that's going to kill a lot of birds with one stone. You can use that video to go to a YouTube channel. You can use that video to go to, Facebook's getting into video now, or they have been for a while, but they're getting a lot more aggressive at it. You can use that on your Facebook page. You can slice and dice that video up and put it on Instagram stories and just use it in other mediums. Then you can extract the audio from that video and then turn it into a podcast, right? Or other clips and sound bites that you can share on social. And then that same video can be transcribed. It can be turned into like a top 5 tips to a blog post. Oftentimes, when people look at completing their wheel of content marketing, it's like, where does your email strategy fit into this? And they're like, oh my God, email. I haven't even I haven't even mastered the blog and the video and the podcast yet. Well, now it's a great way, especially with YouTube's new chapters feature, to use your email as a summary table of contents for video. And this all plays well. Like if you're starting with one source, video, you can turn that into many pieces of content. If you're not ready for like the video investment yet, way at the top of the tier, maybe doing just audio is everything, that I just mentioned. It just sans the video. There's no video component to it. Though you could still publish it to YouTube. People would just be listening to it on YouTube versus just watching it, right? Our YouTube video, our podcast that we did for audience, went out and hit, the 1,000 or so listeners that we get over at the audience podcast. But our video is actually doing really well. I don't know if it's your beautiful face on the YouTube thumbnail, but I mean, we're almost at 500 views on that video. So people are, tuning in and not only watching, but listening there too. So it really helps wrap that up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was trying to make sure I understood, because I think podcasts are unique in the sense that, especially for folks out there who listen to podcasts, like there's something kind of intimate about podcasts because it's something you can take with you anywhere you go, and especially in like the non-work moments. So like driving a car, going on a walk, working out, stuff like that. It's like it's with you, and it's the only thing that you're kind of paying attention, like the main thing, like input. So I think there's something sort of special about audio. Whereas with video, yeah, I guess you could look at your phone and like YouTube while you're walking, but it's a little weird and clunky, and that's not really how people consume video. The point is, I think podcasting and audio content is kind of a unique, special thing, and it can be really powerful if you use it that way.
100%. I mean, that it is, that intimacy, that portability is really unmatched. And again, I know like YouTube is massive for like music listening, you know, for people to listen to music. So they just play it in the background and it plays, and it's no different than, you know, than podcasting. And I wouldn't, you know, I would bet that in the next year or so, YouTube will do something for podcasters. I mean, I'd imagine so. I mean, I can imagine just translating their chapters feature into like a podcast only feature would be really powerful, you know, for audio, not just video. So private podcasts. And so there's two different ways to think about private podcasting. And actually, let me actually show it visually too. I pull up one of my many podcasts and then
how many podcasts do you subscribe to?
Oh boy, that I subscribe to, probably 30.
Wow, that's pretty good.
I'd say.
I'm around there too. I don't listen to all of them religiously, but
I mean, you definitely pick and choose, and that's certainly a lesson for like people who are like trying to market their podcast. Is headlines, cover art, things like that, very important. All right, share screen. I'm gonna do it this way. I think actually no, I'll just do it this way. Brave share. So here we are. This is just a dashboard of Castos, and I want to show you what private podcasting. There's two different ways to go about it. So if I go to my distribution, so primarily, private podcasting has been around for quite some time, right? The way that people distribute podcasts is known as the RSS feed, right? This is something that's an invaluable sort of highway of content for websites to communicate with each other and download their content. RSS feed being private means that this little link right here, and it might be hard to see, but you'll see right here, this global private RSS feed. This is something that has existed for quite some time, and it's essentially just an RSS feed that we just don't want to put in, let's say, iTunes or Spotify. But anybody with this private RSS link can listen to your private podcast. So this is a way of one, you know, for a podcast that's not, you know, you're putting out content that maybe might not be super premium. You might not be, you know, exposing the secret sauce of your product or your service or your consultancy, and you don't mind if people get access to this. We see a use case of this for people who are doing things like business groups. I mean, at least from our angle, like Chamber of Commerce, BNIs, you know, softball leagues, right? Like, these are links where, you know, they're not worried if somebody gets access to this RSS feed, and they can still listen to it and subscribe to it on their phones or wherever they listen to podcasts. But it's not super top secret. The other piece, and the one that we've worked with MemberSpace for, is individual private subscribers via email. Or this native connection that we have with MemberSpace. So you can see, this is just a test podcast, obviously, but we have a whole bunch of test accounts here that are subscribed via email. So this means that each link, like TomBrady@Castos.com, will get a unique link to listen to my private podcast. And this could be your members. This could be your premium members connected to MemberSpace. This could be, you know, whatever, your community members connected through MemberSpace, whatever it is. At any point, you can remove access and revoke access. And, you know, this is sort of the killer feature in the private podcasting world is you have somebody who pays you for access to your membership site. They're downloading digital products, you know, via MemberSpace, and that connection is made over our, you know, integration. And then you can remove them when they're no longer customers. So They pay for a year, they get access for a year, and then if they don't renew that next year, boom, this private link is revoked, and they no longer get any additional podcast episodes from you, right? And that is scratching or just a tip of the iceberg with, you know, where we'll eventually go with private podcasting. But we've seen people do this for, you know, multiple segments of their customers. Maybe if you have multiple types or tiers to your community, you can put up content, as many private podcasts as you want on Castos, and feed them directly to your multiple customers, right? Even if your membership's on MemberSpace, and Ward, you might correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you've seen anybody do this, but we have customers of Castos who use private podcasting for individual customers. So these are people who are like health consultants, health and fitness consultants. We have some people who are, like mental health consultants. And instead of meeting through Zoom or Skype or something like that, their membership is literally augmented. The value is augmented through delivering a private podcast. It's almost like audio messaging, to a degree. And they're delivering private podcasts for individual users. And it's pretty amazing what we've seen people do these days with private podcasting in terms of like training and education of large teams, large organizations, sales enablement teams, that kind of thing. Private podcasting, again, because of like this whole COVID world that we're living in, it's just a new landscape for people to leverage audio, and very powerful. Yeah. Any direct questions from that?
Well, just to jump in real quick for one more clarification for folks out there. So Matt's showing this is, again, from the Castos perspective. They're a host of podcasts. And for anyone who's maybe not even familiar with what that means, like any podcast that people listen to, a podcast is just an audio file, right? It needs to be hosted somewhere, just like a website needs to be hosted somewhere. And that's what Castos does. They host the audio file for you. And what our integration can do is make it so that, all right, only members on specific plans within MemberSpace can get added to or can get access to the private feed for a podcast that's hosted on Castos. And what's nice about the integration is it stays in sync so that if somebody joins or leaves or cancels a plan, they're automatically removed from access to that private feed. That just to make sure everybody is on the same page about what we're actually showing you right here.
Yeah, this is one of the podcasts I do publicly, and this is an entrepreneurial podcast I do for where I live. I'm about an hour south of Boston, so the New England area, South Coast, Mass. And this one up here would be obviously the one that would be considered the public-facing podcast. This is the one that goes out to iTunes. This is the one that everybody gets access to, But if you're somebody that uses your public-facing podcast to drive traffic and get people coming to your membership or selling your products, and you want to offer that value added, right? So if if you're using that podcast as a marketing tool, and then the mechanism is MemberSpace to sell them extra value, boom, you connect up your MemberSpace account to your private podcast, and then you can deliver that added value, right? These are things that are like audible cues that you can put into your public podcast and say things like, maybe you're doing an interview show and you can say, hey, I had a great interview with Ward, but Ward shared his best secret for running a SaaS business or whatever on the private podcast. You'll only get this if you're a private podcast subscriber, right? And then you entice them to go do that call to action, sign up through your MemberSpace membership plan, and then automatically through our integration, they'll get this private podcast, right? Content that's not publicly available. Cool. How to get started with a private podcast. So you sort of saw a little hint of it right here. It is fairly easy and intuitive with our platform. When you're on the Castos hosted site, again, you're creating your podcast here. You have this private podcast. One of the other things too is if in the back of your head, you're like, man, private podcast sounds too far out, but I want to do a public podcast. And sometimes there's that roadblock of like, I'm not ready to launch my podcast yet. You're a little uncertain. You're thinking things like, I want to refine it. I want to make sure like I have all my guests lined up, stuff like that. The other advantage to private podcasts is it's almost like skipping the line kind of thing. Like you don't have to distribute to iTunes right away, especially if you're afraid to just like put it out there and you want to do like this little beta launch, if you will. You can set up just a private podcast and send people or put it on your website and say, hey, you can listen to my podcast with just this private link, or you can use the individual subscribers that we just talked about if you want. I kind of like it for that too, because you're saying, hey, I'm not ready to put it out on iTunes yet. I want to refine some things, but I don't mind trying it out with a few select people that I know, friends, family, my mom, my best listener, right, of the podcast. You put that stuff out there and you could say, hey, look, don't worry about iTunes yet. Just go to my website or sign up for my free membership on my MemberSpace account and it'll connect it too, So that's also another interesting twist. And then when you're ready, you can just change it to a public podcast and then submit your feed to iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify, right? That kind of thing. You can click it, drop it into Spotify, click it, drop it into Amazon Music. They just recently launched last month, I think. So there's some flexibility there. An interesting twist for some people who might be thinking that. But getting started with that private podcast, setting up the feed, all of that stuff is handled on our platform. And it's fairly straightforward, fairly intuitive. You name it, you give it a description, you pick your cover image, you pick the categories that you're gonna launch your podcast into. And a lot of this stuff is unnecessary if it's going to be completely private. Though, some categories in there so that your podcast players will pick up on that. You're filling out all the standard admin stuff, name, email, contact settings. And then that distribution point is really the most important. It's just saying things like switch to a private podcast and then connect this feed using this link. Now with MemberSpace, the integration happens on the MemberSpace side where you would connect up you take our API key and you copy that API key right here. You drop it into your MemberSpace dashboard, and then that will connect up to your MemberSpace account. You go to youtube.com/Castos.
And if you want, Matt, at some point, I can show my screen to kind of show from the MemberSpace perspecbe, unless that's what you're showing now.
Yeah. So if we go into this wonderful video that I made a little while ago, we do the API tokens plus the integration. You grab that API, and then you select, for folks that can see that on my screen, when you drop in the API key, it'll ask you which plan do you want to connect to on your MemberSpace site, and then which podcast you want people to automatically subscribe to.
Yeah.
And that's what that looks like.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the biggest challenge is not that connection. It's you as the creator to make the podcast, right? That's the biggest challenge, right? That's where it comes in, is having a decent plan for that. And there's many ways to go about, setting up your podcast and producing content. But happy to answer any other questions around like the connection side, and then maybe we can talk about the creative side.
Yeah, let me look in the ask a question section. All right. So a question was, is the revocation of access automated? So yeah, like basically, I assume the question is in the context of if somebody cancels a membership plan that was giving access to a private podcast feed, is that automated? And the answer is yes, with our integration with Castos. Yep. Whatever plans so like when you're doing the integration in MemberSpace, you check off, okay, I want plan 1 and plan 2 and to be part of this. And then you check off below that which Castos private podcasts you want to integrate with. So we then keep that in sync. If someone is on one of those 2 plans, they then have access to one or two of those private podcasts. And if somebody cancels either of those plans, they automatically lose access to the private podcast feed. So yeah, that's just automated.
Yeah. The nature of podcasting, because it's open, the RSS feed, and just the nature of it, people will still have, because one of the other questions that we get often is, will people still have access to the other podcast episodes that they already downloaded? Well, yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, there's no way we can delete the files from their phone. And plus, technically they've already paid for that value. So those podcast files are there. They'll just never get another podcast episode from you. Right. Again, once they're revoked, that unique RSS feed link is just removed from the system.
Right.
But yeah, like really the technical bits are not the hard parts. It's producing the show, finding the valuable content, and there's plenty of ways to structure that. You could also have just an RSS link for an ad-free show, right? That's like an easy one. So if you have like an ad-supported or supported podcast, you could have one that has that audio file without the ads. It could just be value-added content. So again, like an extended version, a director's cut, a behind-the-scenes kind of thing. There's one that's a pretty popular podcast, and of course, I literally just switched phones, so I don't have, I didn't import my Overcast to it yet. I'm trying to think of who the person is. Anyway,
what's the model that they're using?
So their model that they're using is you get the first hour of their podcast for free, or it's roughly an hour, like 45 minutes to an hour. And then the extended version is all on their paid subscription, right? So they do something like, I think it might be like $99 for the year. They do 52 episodes or roughly 52 episodes a year, so they get that extended cut in the private version. Right.
Yeah, I've heard of that before. I know a popular podcast is the Sam Harris podcast.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Okay. Yeah. he does something like that. I remember. Yeah.
So like when I think the first thing he starts off with, or the audio starts off with, like, if you're hearing this now, you're not listening to the pro version or whatever, the premium version, whatever he calls it. And it's a fantastic call to action. It's immediate. It's right there. And it just lets you know that, I can get something more. Right. Mm-hmm. So pretty cool.
Do you want to dive into some of the, like you had talked about before, repurposing some of the podcast content and like categorizing it? Because I think that's a good point generally about content, that it's not necessarily about the volume. Like, sure, having a certain volume is important, but you also don't want to overwhelm people by having just mountains and mountains of content. And if we just keep it in the podcast world, if you have, let's say, 1,000 podcasts, that's cool in some sense. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff for people to look through. As for the first time, they could subscribe, right? And they'll get all the new episodes, but they have no context for, which past episodes were relevant for me, which past episodes would be useful for my business or my situation or whatever it is that you're trying to help them with. And to make them manually go through the title of 1,000 podcasts is not useful and a disincentive. So I'm sure you have some ideas around how to categorize your content to be repurposed, to be discoverable for the right time at the right moment for the right person, right?
Yeah. Let me pull up a couple links. And I can't say that I have it solved for Castos yet. It is something that I've been hired to help with. So let me just show you something. And pull this up, and it's sort of along the line. So your episode, we'll use your episode as one example. Let me just get everything over here. Okay.
Like this is like an example of how to like think through the content structure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Boom, boom. Application window, share. So so here's your episode. This is, I guess I should reinforce it because maybe not everyone thinks of it this way. But when people say, "Oh boy, I have a podcast, but I really haven't thought about like putting it on a website or having a blog or that kind of thing." The podcast, and it's fine. Like we totally understand that not everyone has the time to like create all this stuff or even the time to manage it all. And it's fine if you're just doing a podcast and there's no other content around it, but just know that this stuff can be restructured. So when we have, let's say, your podcast, why podcasters should care about member only sites, when we interviewed you, so we have that audio episode, of course, and for obvious reasons we create a blog post out of it, and this is for searchability, right? So this is us saying, okay, our podcast is out there. It's on iTunes, but we're not just relying on all those distribution points like iTunes, Google, Spotify, etc. We're going to turn that into a blog post where we summarize the podcast episode. And we're also using, of course, keywords that people hopefully are searching for, your name, your brand name, our name, podcasting, membership sites, that kind of thing. And there's some link building opportunities in here where we link back to you, your company, and then linking it to other articles that we've published on our own platform before, right? So that's like obvious step number one. You have a podcast and you also connect it up to, let's say, we're fans of WordPress, right? With our WordPress plugin. So you're using your WordPress site as the blog section. And then we're repurposing the audio file into a video on YouTube. Now it's just a video. I won't play the whole thing, obviously, but it's just a video, but it's our recorded episode, and we kill two birds with one stone, right? We have it on our YouTube channel, so that people can view it there. YouTube being the second largest search engine in the world, right? There's yours right there, 479 views, and it's just another great way to repurpose it. One of the things that we are looking at is creating and categorizing all of this stuff into an official quote unquote academy, right? That we're going to put together. But as another example, one of the things that we do, I love YouTube thumbnails. Like, I mean, it's just a face for radio right there. One of the things that we do is we have this thing over at castos.com/podcast grader, and you get a little grade on your podcasting journey, right? And then once you fill that out, you can get a free private podcast where we break down a bunch of different blueprints for being a podcaster. So if you want a blueprint for Notion or Google Sheets, let's just open that one because I don't want to open up Notion just in case it opens up some other stuff. But we have these checklists that we give out for free on how to structure a podcast. And we make a podcast, we're using audio content to also describe our marketing material, right? And those are, part of it is repurposed shows, one repurposed show that we talk about, but the other 4 parts are unique to this private podcast. So we're able to mix and match content, if that makes sense. And those are 2 different ways to go about it.
I got a question, Matt. If you go back to the blog post version of our episode that we did together on audience, so this makes sense to me, right? It's like, okay, cool. We got the audio. You auto publish it to YouTube, so that's video and audio. You got a blog post, which is just kind of repurposing what was said in the podcast with a little bit of extra work. So you're kind of distributing it in all these ways, all from one core central asset, which was the podcast recording, which I think is really smart. And I hope that's something that people can take away from this, regardless of whether you're using this for a membership or not. That's just kind of a useful thing to do. But my question is on the blog post. I mean, I get trying to maybe create your own little blog post, unique content. Why not just use the transcript of the podcast as the blog post?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So sometimes the transcripts, people just don't want to read through them all, right? And I think in a world where there is literally so much competition to consume content, I know I'm of the mind where if I can quickly see, like in that blog post we had, what you'll learn in this episode, and we're trying to just give you really quick, like, because you know how it is, like, do I want to listen to, like you said, I subscribe to like 30 episodes or 30 podcasts. Am I going to listen to every single one? Probably not. But if you can quickly tell me, 1, starts with a great headline. 2, if I can click on the show notes and see what I'm going to learn in this episode, well, then I'll be more apt to stick around, and listen to it, right? Or
Mhm.
at least consume some of this content. So yeah, transcripts definitely great to do that. But oftentimes I know I've gone back to look at transcripts of podcasts I've listened to. I'm like, no, man, there's too much text. And I'm searching, I'm hitting Control F and I'm searching like, what was that keyword that I was looking for? And I'm trying to find it. So it's really just a quick scan and searchability thing. As reason why we'd probably do something like a show notes, right? Where there's like important links highlighted, that kind of thing.
But it sounds like that's an important folks to take away too, is a legit show notes. Don't lazy there, basically, like make it useful, right?
Yeah.
Like
yeah, I mean, it's great for both. I mean, accessibility for transcripts 100%, right? Screen readers, people who are hearing impaired, they want to be able to find the stuff using the screen reading tools or reading tools that they use or whatever. Still 100% important. And there is SEO. I hate the phrase SEO juice, but there's SEO juice to be had, and where it's getting indexed, that kind of thing too.
Yeah, I hear you. And yeah, I just think I just know from my own personal experience, when I look at a podcast, when I click on like, the info section, you look at the notes and it's just like, there's no links, or it's just like, hope you like our episode. It's just like, that's useless. Like I, as the listener, don't want to have to like rewind the podcast to hear the guest to mention a resource. I should like that resource should just be linked in the show notes. Like do the work for your audience to help them get the most out of your podcast. Cause that'll also incentivize them to listen to more episodes, because they know you're going to take all the good stuff out, all the highlights out, and make it easy for me to digest it. And I think that's just a really smart thing to do in general.
Yeah, and it takes, when people, another popular question is like, well, how many episodes should I do a month? Again, that's for a public facing podcast. That's the primary question. With private podcasts, there's creative freedom there. You do as many as you want, right? It's like as many as the value that you're delivering. But when people say, how do I grow my audience? How do I get more awareness, et cetera? It's like, well, can you podcast every day? No? Okay, then don't do it every day. Like try to do something that fits your cadence. If you can do it once a week, that's amazing. If you can do it twice a month, still amazing. It really depends on where you're at in, with your business and your marketing prowess. But even if you can only do it one time a month, it's still better than nothing. And don't forget, if that episode goes out at the first week, so you have your episode goes out in the first week and you have this blog post that goes with it, you have 3 other weeks, right? Roughly in the month. Now you can take that episode and that's one of your email newsletters, right? It's like summarizing the super value in this content, but make it unique though, right? Like you focus on making this like a unique email. Don't just send the link and say, here, listen. You pitch it as, hey, there's something very unique in this email that's coming to you. There's a summary that you're only going to get on my newsletter. Make sure you join and listen to that. And then you have these other weeks where you're taking audio bites out of that podcast episode, tweeting them out, putting them on Facebook, using them as ads, like however you're growing your audience. You have plenty of time to take one episode, or plenty of opportunity, I should say, to create one episode a month and then just use that as your marketing wheel for the entire month. There's plenty of ways to dissect that stuff and promote it, especially when you're growing that podcast in the beginning.
Yeah. And you got to remember, most people, they're not going to just necessarily click on everything that you tweet or everything that you email out or everything you put on your website or your blog or your podcast feed. So even if it's, rehashed versions of something you've put out, that's okay, because it might have just caught them just then. They might have ignored all the other messages until that day. So it's okay. And if they haven't, they can ignore that one. Like it's okay. Yeah. It's okay.
Especially if your main audience or your main social channel is Twitter, forget about it, because it's just like, it literally just is a fire hose of, stuff, and it goes by in seconds, right? I mean, it goes by in seconds. Whereas maybe there's a little bit more algorithm longevity. Is that even a thing on like Facebook and LinkedIn, where you're posting it and it surfaces around for a little bit longer than say a Twitter? And then you might say the color red in your headline and people are like, I hate the color red. But then you say the color blue in a headline, all relates to the same episode. And they go, oh, blue. I want to listen to it now. It's like you give yourself and your content a chance by extending the promotional period, right? Because that's where and this gets more into like the creator world, but this is where a lot of people burn out in podcasting, content creation is they're like, oh God, it's so much work and nobody's listening, nobody's clicking, nobody's tuning in. Well, you should be promoting much more than you are creating, especially in the early days, right? You know, you want to promote, you want to have that clear piece of content in week 1, and then give yourself those next 3 weeks to promote the heck out of it until you start building up an audience where that network effect is starting to turn a little bit. Now you have an audience. Now you have 100 super fans that tweet this stuff out for you as soon as you go live with it.
So why would you switch to doing more content creation, less promotion as you get an audience? Is it because you're saying the audience is going to help you amplify it and they're hungry for more volume of content at that point?
Yeah. Like if you're just starting out, you know, I say you do 1 episode and you just promote the heck out of it for that next 3 weeks, right? Every 30 days, like you look at it as a 30-day plan. You want to give yourself that chance. And then you start to maybe do 2 episodes, 3 episodes a month, and you really start to broaden your horizon because you have an audience and then there's an expectation. So in the recent episode I did on the Audience podcast, I took a clip from Tim Ferriss's recent episode with Seth Godin, you know, prolific marketer. I'm sure you know Seth Godin and sort of his tales of marketing. He just talked about this too, and I thought it was one of the best Seth Godin clips that I've heard in quite some time, where he says, look, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, is like if you're an HVAC company, heating, ventilation, and AC, you only really need 200 customers to like run a super, profitable business. And, quite often we can get lost in just a numbers game. We want more. We want like more downloads. We want more subscribers. The question is why, right? Especially for memberships. It's like, do we need 2,000 members here, or can we do with 200 and just be super profitable, right? We had the Kevin Kelly's 1,000 super true fans, and then Anderson Horowitz A16Z did 100 something fans, right? To kind of say, well, you have 1,000 true fans at $10, but you could have 100 fans at $100 and make more money, or whatever the math is. It's the same thing with like podcasting and membership stuff. If you're delivering ultra valuable content to people, you don't need to go for the big numbers game, right? Yeah. And I feel like in the beginning, too many people get caught up in just the numbers and forgetting about the super fans.
Yeah, I think it's a solid point, because a lot of folks don't necessarily, even if you somehow magically got 2,000 members, which is hard to do, if you got that paying members, would you even want it? Like the amount of work goes along with that in terms of support, questions, follow-ups, emails. It's a lot. So yeah, you think about that long and hard in terms of how much you want to charge for your membership. Yeah. You generally want to charge a little bit more and have less members overall.
Yeah. I started my career in web design remember the back in the days, like I can get $500 a website, and then you start telling everybody about it, and you're like, this is the worst idea I've ever created, right? Because now everyone is coming after me for a $500 website, and it is the worst business that I ever got into.
I make 10,000 websites. I'll be really
ooh, like which Porsche am I going to buy as soon as I publish this next website?
Right. Awesome. Do we have anything else on the slides or the agenda to go over?
No, those were the top 3 slides. And if anybody's interested in talking, I've got the video on how to set it up on the MemberSpace side. I'm always happy to talk to people who want to talk about private podcasting or just podcasting in general. Matt@castos.com. Happy to answer any questions that anybody has for me.
Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and post a link here in the chat for our guide on how to integrate member-only podcasts with Castos.
There you go.
Thanks, Natalia, for posting that. Okay. And then Matthew Wood said he has a couple of use cases for this. How do I stay in touch if I don't want to sign up just yet? Yeah, so I'm not sure if you're referring to stay in touch with me or stay in touch with Matt, but if you want to stay in touch with MemberSpace, it's just support@memberspace.com. And then Matt, if you want to share any contact details.
Yeah, I'll put in our general one too, hello@castos.com. Or I'll just do castos.com/podcastgrader. That'll put you on our email list as well. And there's a bunch of resources on that link, the one I showed on before. So it's a bunch of blueprints, Notion, Google Docs, and ClickUp, and then a free private podcast. So you can kind of get a feel for what it's like to subscribe to a private podcast and see that whole interaction.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Matt, for your time here and to give your wisdom on the
podcast. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Cool. All right, everybody. Take care.